everyone, and thank you for joining us today in what we hope is going to be a very interesting dialogue between me. I'm Pavan Dhaliwal, and I have been working within criminal justice reform and human rights sector for over 15 years. Many of those years I've known Theo, and we're together today to talk about Theo's new book, Power, Race and Justice, the restorative dialogue we will not have. And I suspect you all know Theo and his career history and his academic record and his work. So Theo, if it's okay with you, should we go straight into it?
Yeah, thank you, Pavan. Welcome to another episode of the RJ webinar series. Well, for a change, I'm not hosting the seminars, Pavan is. Bit of an unusual version of them. No, thank you, Pavan, for doing this, and it's a pleasure to have you as part of the series. Yeah, go ahead, ask me the questions.
Okay, well, so first of all, congratulations on publishing this, which is your sort of seminal work, your life's work, all brought together. But first of all, I want to actually just go into the title. Because I think it's quite a loaded title. So the restorative dialogue that we will not have. So could you explain the rationale behind the title? Why will we not have the dialogue?
Yeah, so, I mean, as you said, this book, I mean, I've been writing about restorative justice for 20 years now, probably more. But this one, it's been one of the hardest but the most enjoyable writings for me, and it was the hardest because, as you'll see in the book, there was just something behind everything that I was doing, my professional, personal life, but also in my academic work, that was bothering me, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And we were talking, we worked together on race issues, different organizations in the NGO sector. I'm now running Restorative Justice for, and we were all trying to fix stuff, whether it's, we're calling it race inequality or discrimination, human rights violations, abuse, all these sort of things. And, we were all trying to do stuff, and yet I was not feeling satisfied that I actually identified the source of the problem. The other thing that was bothering me was that I was seeing all these different camps and all these different groups fighting for one cause, but never actually joining the forces, and sometimes even competing against each other. So that was one of the main reasons it took me 20 years to write this book. And each chapter is a chapter of my life, really. Why the loaded title? It reflects, the complexity, the controversy, I would say, as well, of the book, but also the feelings that I have, the conflicting feelings that I had inside me. And having served the restorative justice and criminal justice and human rights movements for so long, I felt there's certain stuff that we talk a lot about things that they're doing to us, but we never take the time to talk about things that we're doing as a movement, and things that we should be doing to address conflicts within ourselves and within the movement. And obviously, as the book says, and that's the main word within the book, power is the key denominator here, is what brings everything together. And power, when we say power, usually we think of a bad thing. It can be bad, it can be good. And power within the movement, within ourselves, can be a good tool, but it can also be a very, very bad lever, which we can use either consciously or subconsciously to either create further inequalities or actually address them, right? So why the dialogue we will not have? Because we need to be conscious of our own power to be able to have that dialogue. And to be able to be conscious of your own power, you need to become the watcher of yourself. So when we exercise this power, we all have power. We don't need to have a big job to have a power. We have the power as a parent, we have the power as a friend. This interview has power. dynamics. You're interviewing me. I am, got a set position. I'm running the series. We all have powers. How we use that power, but be able to have a discussion about that power and how we use it means that we have already asked ourselves, and we have already identified that power within ourselves and asked ourselves how we're using that power. And that's a very, very hard thing to do. It means that we are becoming, we are awakening. That's why I was saying it took me so many years, because I felt I was asleep. I was doing stuff, I was going to work, I was trying to help the whatever movement, gender movements, equality movements, race equality movements, human rights movements, trying to do my bit, but I felt that I was asleep. And when you wake up and you realize there's power dynamics around us and how everything connects, then you're awakened. And then you have the debate that I'm trying to have with this book.
Right, okay, so what you're sort of describing there is almost like a form of reflective practice, but for the RJ sector as a whole, as a movement. Why do you think that people have been reluctant to question their own power within the movement? I'm sure that you've come across a lot of people talk about moral licensing, and do you think that there is an element of that where there are so many people, I'm sure we're all guilty of it, where we're working in sectors, we're working for movements, we're activists, we feel that we're on the right side of things, so therefore we're probably less reluctant to question our own motivations and our own power, and the power that we exert when we're actually in the roles that we're in. Do you think there's an element of that, or do you think that maybe conversations have taken place, but maybe in a more sort of disparate way, and not a more sort of wholesale conversation that involves the movement as a whole?
Yeah, I would say definitely all the above. It's a very hard conversation to have. Just to take a step back, one of the hardest things about this book was the fact that I felt I had to combine personal beliefs, my own personal stories, but at the same time remain, as an academic book that you can reference and you can use, as a source of evidencing, because, I'm a researcher, so I like evidencing and talking from evidence, but at the same time, it was a very personal statement. So it was hard for me to balance both. I hope I achieved it. It also exposed me as a person, so it opened the doors for people to know me better as a writer and as somebody who writes about the restorative justice movement, but not in a campaigning way, in a self-critique way. And you're right, it is mainly about restorative justice and, the non-formal criminal justice way of dealing with conflicts. But it's more than that as well. So, it can be picked up by anyone who has an interest in understanding the power that they have and what they can do about it and how it can be used within ourselves, but also externally to improve the world, right? To improve what's happening around us and improve ourselves first. As far as the RJ movement is concerned, yes, the conversations, there are some of them in terms of self-critique, and some of the people that have done the self-critique within the movement have been part of this series as well, but not in a cohesive and collective way that allows a really good chat and a really good debate about who we are. And one of the biggest issues that I have about the movement is that it's based on the the principle of dialogue. It's based on the principle of power sharing, and yet I have seen many organizations within, and I'm not talking just about the UK here, I'm talking internationally, right? And this book is going to be launched during International Restorative Justice Week at the University of East London, which is hosting the event and also supporting the book. And that week, it's been going on for so many years. So many organizations come together during that week. But beyond that, I have seen so many organizations competing against each other and not also being honest with their contributions.
Okay. Before I ask you what your sort of what your own sort of personal learning was around your own use of power and your own sort of role within the framework in which you've written, so of course we're talking we're in 2021. there are lots of things going on domestically, internationally, abuses of power, human rights violations. The systemic inequality remains. Why now for this book? Why did you not write it 5 years ago or 4 years ago or indeed 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I wasn't really awake 10 years ago. I started the process of actually writing the book a few years ago when something personal happened to me. So I kind of started to question myself. And it was actually when I became a dad myself, and that gave me the reality of a number of dynamics, including you being a parent and what that means, right? Which is a clear power, within your own home. But the material that I used to put the book together stretched as far as 2001, and I'm looking at what I was writing then, and this underlying topic of power abuse and how that power brings together and bridges all these different inequalities. I was thinking about it, but I was never actually articulating it because I wasn't realizing it. Why now? As I said, because I was awake and Routledge also agreed to publish it after I said, I've got this crazy idea, and they supported it, and here it is now ready to be launched. But also because, now more than ever after COVID, I think the inequalities are widening and will continue to widen. And we need to stop thinking in silos. And I hope that by bringing this topic, this cross-cutting theme of power abuse, that movements, and I brought race within this book prominently for a reason, they stop looking at it as an isolated problem, because power abuse brings all of those inequalities together. Now, I don't want to undermine the work that's been done, and I acknowledge all those things, the campaigning and all the fights and all the deaths that have taken place to progress matters in different equality strands.
We are now mid 2021. Slowly crawling out of the pandemic, and yet the world outside of us also seems to be imploding. We're a year on from the beginning of the Black Lives Matter protests in the UK. See, there's so much going on. Why this book now?
And COVID-19 is definitely, one of the reasons I think this book couldn't be more timely. I think we've already experienced the widening gap of inequalities, and I think that will continue with poverty becoming a bigger and bigger issue for specific groups. And again, that's not by coincidence, and that's what this book is trying to say. And there's certain truths that I'm trying to reveal. Now, not kind of in a kind of what you call it, like conspiracy theory way. I hope is a very kind of evidence-based, academic and constructive way that opens the honest dialogue that we need to have. I couldn't do this 10 years ago because, as I said before, I was not awakened. So I was writing and working within different human rights movements, race equality movements, and so on. But I wasn't really awakened. I was trying to do stuff, but not really realizing that, the consistent pattern of inequalities is because of power abuse and the different levers that are being used to achieve that abuse of power, which, as I said, everybody has that possibility, but certain groups within society have that privilege. Now, if we are, you mentioned the Black Lives Movement, and I made reference to race specifically within this book. I think for a couple of reasons, and I gave some examples of the work that we were doing in the past on race inequality, and this particular strand has remained, especially in the UK and the US, quite vocal. And while acknowledging the work that has been done, I hope that with the truths that I'm trying to acknowledge within this book will advance the movement, not in the sense that it's got something to lose or something to integrate or something to give away, but in the sense that there are more things to be gained by acknowledging the common thread that we're all, trying to deal with if we are trying to address the power abuse that surrounds us. Okay, and as I expect that these gaps of inequality and poverty will continue, and in fact will get worse, because we're only just experiencing the impact of COVID. I think with this book we could, and I hope, create some sort of small revolution. And as Martin Luther King said, it's with little things that will make a huge difference. And if you can't do huge things, at least try and do small things, because small things, if they're done by each one of us, then they will end up big things.
Okay, so in which case, let's go back to the sort of the ongoing impact that in particular the Black Lives Matter UK movement had last year, which obviously has come about after decades and decades of inequality, racism, discrimination, intergenerational trauma, all of those things associated with that. A sort of restorative approach could possibly be one of truth and reconciliation that would sort of tie in with a sort of restorative approach. But of course, you talk about power, and one thing we know about power is that people who have it do not concede it very easily. So what do you see? How do you see progress being made around this area, particularly the need for restoration, for accountability?
Yeah, that's a very good kind of practical question. And the book, I suppose, it's kind of split into different parts. The first part is more kind of theoretical, but there's also a practical side of the book. And in fact, I even have at the last part kind of a guide for policymakers and practitioners on how to use specific tools that are offered within the book to address power abuse, and in this case, obviously, power abuse that relates to race inequality. So one of the things that was bothering me in the past, and it is mentioned in this book, and I brought evidence to it, is that there were a lot of claims within the restorative justice movement that it can address power of race, issues of race inequality. So when you have hate crimes or crimes against because of crimes that are motivated because of race, and there's a lot of rhetoric about it. People were claiming that these sort of cases have been addressed, and when I'm saying cases, I don't just mean chats and dialogues, and truth and reconciliation committees kind of have their contribution, which is kind of more at the community level of restoring some sort of sense of peace within the community. But I'm also talking about claims relating to diverting the criminal justice case from the criminal justice system at all stages. So it could be, at the police stage, CPS stage, court stage, sentencing stage, or even prison, right? Divert it and say to the victim, look, we're going to be dealing with your case through RJ, and it's going to be a better case, a better resolution for you. So please agree, or the other way around, for the offender to just say, look, the victim wants to do this case. There's going to be a better resolution for you. So all those claims have been said in one way or another through campaigning, through academic, theoretical writing, and all these sort of things. But in all honesty, with all the research that I've done, I've seen very little evidence of success. So I had to look into that, why this particular type of case is so difficult for restorative justice. So that's one of the truths that I mentioned before that needs to be said, and then investigate the weaknesses of restorative justice around this kind of cases, right? Then there are other cases as well, domestic violence, for example, or gender-based violence, and so on. So again, what I concluded looking at the evidence and specific cases that I was researching and observing was that when these cases were involved, and the mediator or the conference facilitator or the circle that was taking place was bringing the two parties together, including the impacted community, there was always this power dynamics. Okay, so that power dynamic between let's call them the offender or the person who has harmed, and the victim, the person who has been harmed, that power between them was not absent So it was present within the room, right? Which is not something that you get in other cases, right? Take shoplifting, for example, or there's no power in the room. But when it comes to the person and the identity of the person, in this case, the race, and the offense or the harm relates to that particular aspect of their identity, when these two parties meet, whether directly or indirectly, doesn't really matter, that power dynamic is present. So what needs to be done, I mean, I'm not saying it's not impossible, and I have seen actually successful, very successful cases, is the practitioner needs to be extra trained and have specific support and specific training for these particular cases which involve power dynamics. And I mentioned domestic violence and gender-based violence as other examples, right? So you can't just have a normal restorative justice, any kind of junior mediator bringing these parties together, because in the end you're going to end up harming the parties and actually having a worse case than the one that the criminal justice system is offering, right? As I said, there are cases that have been dealt with very, very well, but these are cases that were prepared very well, that the practitioner was aware of the potential for power abuse and power dynamics, and there was scaling. There was a lot of stages before the actual dialogue would take place. The other thing that people forget about restorative justice is that any party at any point during the process should be able to withdraw. So if that power becomes too much, or is not leading where it should be leading, and is actually feeling that we are being re-victimized, or the case is not being dealt with as it should, then they should just discontinue, and the practitioner should just say stop.
Right. Okay. So it seems to me that what you're arguing against there is this sort of standardized, institutionalized, off-the-shelf type of restorative justice. But what you present as part of your case studies in your book is obviously lots of different examples of RJ being done really well. So is that what you're saying is that the moment in which it sort of becomes this sort of standardized alternative to the justice system, then it becomes diluted, because it should be bespoke. It should be completely tailored to a particular situation, taking into account the sort of intersectionality, the power dynamics, which makes sense. But then from the other side, if you're thinking about sort of public agencies who want to take this on because they see that actually RJ can be a really powerful tool, how to marry that conflict?
Yeah, you made a very, very good point there, Pavan. I tried to unpack it in the book, and the only way I could was to use philosophy. You saw the chapters on Aristotle, right? So I was trying to understand, how this offer that is made by restorative justice, which is a very specific offer, is not the sausage machine of the criminal justice system. It's something that, is very personal to you, and it can transform you as somebody who has been harmed or somebody who has harmed somebody. So it's very specific, and I call it as part of Aristotle's equity theory, which it makes sense only when it's particular to that person. And that's when the transformation can happen, because it's so personal to you. And I use catharsis and the Greek tragedy as an example of where, the watcher of the tragedy cleanses themselves through pain. And after the pain, which is a very constructive pain, takes place, then you become a new person. And that's what restorative justice should be all about. It is a painful process. And through the dialogue that we're having, we're creating the pain that then transforms us in a very personal way and takes us out of that process as new people. It makes us new, right? Now, how do you integrate that very personal, painful experience, within the criminal justice system, or any system, which by default you say system, and automatically you're thinking of this, different things that are working together to produce lots of things in a very, efficient way and in a very cost-effective way. Well, that's where things start to go wrong, because when you're trying to roll out restorative justice through a 3-day training course for prison officers, that also needs to be, cheap and, being able to be certified and all these sort of things, and then starting to be doing cases and counting the cases, then I think Pavan is just not going to work, because restorative justice is not that kind of, I don't think it should be making that offer. Restorative justice was born out of communities and was led by communities. That's why I was calling it community-led, for a reason. It wasn't state-led. It was, and also, I wrote a little bit about the history of restorative justice. It was the main way that tribes and communities were using to address conflict. It's when the state was created, and after the Middle Ages, and the state took over, that the criminal justice system started to develop and the machinery started to take place, right, and take over the conflict. Niels Christie wrote in the 70s about conflict as property and individuals taking that conflict back. But it's individuals that are taking the conflict back. It's not the state, right? The state, in my view, and that's where the book concludes in one of the chapters, I present this model of the consensual model of restorative justice, where you have two parallel systems, and I present them as funnels, right? Where you have, in one system, you have the crime, right? And this funnel, to empty it and restore peace, you have the criminal justice system that empties that panel, that funnel. And within this funnel, you have the offender and the victim, and the protective mechanisms is what we call human rights. On the other hand, you have a similar funnel, but within it, to empty it and restore peace, you don't have crime, you have harm, right? And this harm is very personal, and you don't have victims and offenders, you have harmed parties and harming parties. And what you have as protective layers, because abuse can happen in all sort of environments, you have principles, you have ethical standards. You don't have human rights as legal standards, you have ethical standards, right? And why am I saying that? Because in the first one, you have the law, the legalistic way of addressing crime. And in the other one, you have not the law, but what we'd call natural law, right? what regulates us, but not in a legalistic way. What regulates your morality? What regulates you as a person? What regulates you, between you and your friends in your relationships? Those two worlds are not in contradiction. They can live together, and it's how you use both to address the problem, right? And that option should always be with the individual. That's why it's a good thing to offer restorative justice, but it's a bad thing to make it obligatory, or even promise that it's going to replace, the criminal justice system.
Right. Okay. So you see it as a sort of like an additional optional add-on to a more formal process that people can at any point during their journey decide to opt into, obviously with both parties in agreement. But what you're saying is that it shouldn't be, are you basically saying that it shouldn't be as part of the menu of the sentencing council, in terms of if you're looking at a particular harm or crime?
I would say, I don't have a problem introducing elements of restorative justice within the criminal justice system. I've written a lot about co-option, and loads of other RJ practitioners and academics have written about this co-option, but it's how you do it. Yeah. So for example, if you're trying to roll out restorative justice very superficially, whether it's within prisons or the probation system or whatever it is, then that's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to introduce it within sections of the criminal justice system. It's just how you do it. Yeah. So we have loads of examples of probation officers using restorative justice successfully, but we also have loads of examples of probation officers, using restorative justice as a ticking box. And that doesn't mean that restorative justice cannot be introduced into the other funnel. It can complement it. So, for example, while a prisoner serves their sentence in prison, that doesn't mean that they cannot be offered restorative justice within prison. And there's successful programs that are doing that, right?
But that doesn't mean that when you're doing it, that you should make it kind of for criminal justice and a little bit of restorative justice. No, restorative justice should be restorative justice. We should follow the principles of restorative justice, and we know what those principles are.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to slightly shift gear now and go back to a comment that actually you made at the beginning, which is you said that the book was could be seen as controversial. Where do you think the controversy is?
Yeah, this is something that worried me when I, and I did say the book. I went back and forth with it because, obviously, I also run an organization. I've got stuff to do as well. I don't want this to backfire. And one of the things that do worry me is that people may read it and kind of say, oh, who is this, and then put lots of adjectives next to my name, white, middle class, or whatever you want to whatever you want to use, that is talking about, I don't know, race inequality or whatever it is, and how dare you dismiss whatever has been done. And that's why I'm not trying to be defensive from the beginning. I'm trying to kind of set the framework and being honest about my intentions. And those intentions are to actually strengthen these movements. And I am worried that there will be controversy in the sense that we're not ready yet to have this conversation. It takes me back to the title, the dialogue that we won't have, because as I said, we need to be prepared for those discussions. The other thing is that people are still suffering, when you are being discriminated against because of the trait that you have as within yourself and their personality. It's very hard to see beyond that because communities are still suffering. So being able to kind of take a step back and say, actually, there is another way of looking at this, but you're still in pain. So it's very hard to put that pain on hold and kind of start reflecting and saying, actually, I need to join forces with another where, somebody else might not have this, but we're experiencing the same thing because of this reason, right? And this is how we can both work together. So that's something that does worry me because I don't want this to backfire on anybody other than myself. And because I represent so many other things and organizations and, other stuff that I'm doing, I just wanted to kind of make a disclaimer and just say this, they've got nothing to do. These are all my personal experiences and the work that I've done, through my writings and the research that I've been doing. So very well intended, let's put it that way.
Right. Okay. And and I think it's an important point to make that as colleagues, as friends, people who have been involved, reading the book and contributing to it, is that we can actually fundamentally disagree on elements, and that's absolutely fine too. In fact, that's where the dialogue starts. I guess my question for you is, so if we go back to whether whatever those adjectives could be, whether it's white, middle class, obviously educated, titled, how did you recognize that power dynamic in yourself in even approaching the writing of this book?
Yeah, as I said before, I was working with the different equality movements, and I'm trained as a lawyer, but then I stopped doing that. But I was never, consciously doing what I was doing. I was just going along with it. And what helped me to awaken, it wasn't a one day suddenly, hurrah, I can see the world and I can see what's going on. It gradually developed, but it developed from kind of the personal experience of me becoming a dad, or leaving an organization that I set up and just seeing the power that I created around an organization I created, the powers that I was creating around the family that I was creating, and those power dynamics that I was experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and how I was using my own power as a dad or as a CEO, as a founder, to do good. As a man, as whatever, it's you name it. As I said, everybody within ourselves, even the person I think is the weakest person on the planet, has some sort of lever, right? And that's also the hope that I'm trying to give within this book. That don't believe that because there's other bigger powers out there directing certain things and how we do certain stuff, that you don't have power. You do. And, that's the kind of movement that we're trying to create, because little powers coming together address the big power. And that's the big issue here, because the status quo is maintained for a reason, is maintained so that the powers that have, the upper hand continue to be doing it. And that's the hope that, I'm trying to create within this book.
I'm interested in whether you think that there's any hope for the future. If you think about the fact that we operate within certain systems, and we're no closer to dismantling wholesale these systems, and yet we can acknowledge the value that certain practices have. And what you were saying is that these absolutely do have value, but the moment at which you then try to shoehorn them within a system, that's when they then start to lose their value. So what hope do you have for the future of the movement, or otherwise?
When the movement, the restorative justice rhetoric started back in the 70s, they were talking about, abolishing prisons. It was part of the abolitionist movement. Angela Davis talked about closing prisons down and, get rid of them and all these sort of things.
People are still having those discussions, rightly so.
Still having these discussions, which is again what's making this discussion, I think, timely. I don't believe in closing prisons down. I don't believe in, replacing the criminal justice system personally, but I believe in improving them. And I think it's harder to improve a system than just get rid of it, because you're getting rid of it and you're replacing it with what? What is the promise? And definitely restorative justice, in my view, cannot replace the criminal justice system. As I said, is a complementary, voluntary and optional choice, not something that can be forced and can be rolled out as a kind of sausage machine, in the same way that the criminal justice system is treating crime, right, and antisocial behavior. So my hope is, to sum it up, that the movement itself, and whether it's that the restorative justice movement, the human rights movement, the race equality movement, any movement that is trying to address power, right, but particularly the restorative justice movement, enters into a process of self-reflection, acknowledges their limitations, but also the power that they have within them, and start addressing these fault lines. I call them fault lines within the movement, because they are not real. Whether you're talking about, definitional disagreements, whether you're talking about a practice being better than another practice, all these sort of things are not really disagreements. They're not really problems. Whether, somebody's gender discrimination is more important than somebody else's race discrimination. All these sort of things are fault lines. They are there for a reason. They are there to distract us from the actual issue, which is the power abuse that we're all experiencing. So with this discussion, I hope that we'll be able to move on, stop comparing, the non issues and trying to address the non-issues, and start focusing on what the actual issue is, especially now, because this abuse is going to continue and become worse. Okay.
Well, that is fascinating, and I hope that we can do some sort of follow-up, in fact, to a piece of work that I'm going to be doing. And actually, it's going back to the way that you've just described the system there, in terms of how do we change or modify for the better the system that we have? Whereas actually, I think there is room for a conversation as to what if we went back to first principles and had a vision for the system that we wanted and built from there, as opposed to trying to tinker with what we actually already have. And maybe that is part of this wider conversation that needs to be had. What would a wholesale rethink and reset of the system look like? And there's few things that's happened in our lifetime, such as the pandemic, which has really sort of forced these questions upon us. So I hope that will be part of an ongoing dialogue. So on that note, thank you very much. Would you like to have this word?
You, Pavan. No, I think I mean, as you said, now there's a good opportunity, because we're going to see more reforms than any other time, to be honest. It can only be compared with the Second World War. I think what's happening to the economy and, you know, the systems, whether it's criminal justice system, educational system, all sorts of systems, you know, whether it's in the UK or abroad, there will be more reforms than any other time, to be honest. And that's also the time where we need to be asking these questions. And these forces that I was talking about will make it harder for us to have this conversation. So I hope I'm having, you know, I'm doing my bit, starting, you know, with this book. We're going to have this discussion at the university, as I said, with a lecture. There'll be a couple of more seminars as part of this series, and we want, you know, people to join the debate.